This video is brought to you by Squarespace. When playing a game, your mind is usually invested into, well, the game and the music. But let's for a moment turn down the game volume and play in silence. No distractions, we're just looking at the game and listening to the sound of our controllers. One of the most unique aspects of a game is that everyone is going to elicit different feelings about the sound a controller makes. Since we've all devoted different amounts of time and dedication to games, this aspect is unique to everyone. A controller's clicks and clacks have slightly different tones to them, and while you may not pay attention or even hear your controller half the time, your mind has subconsciously memorized what your controller sounds like. For me, one of my favorite sounding controllers is the GameCube one. This is a console I've been playing since I was 10 years old, and a lot of my playtime was with a muted TV and the quiet sounds of flicking. When I twirl the joystick or latch down on the shoulder buttons, I can hear friendship. I spent so much of my childhood playing GameCube games with friends, whether that was an endless amount of Smash Bros. Melee matches or trying to get the highest score in Monkey Target. This controller has such a unique feel to it because of how the buttons function. The joystick is loud yet firm with accuracy. The face buttons have this soft and satisfying press with just enough sound that it doesn't overpower the joystick. The shoulder buttons have a very spring-like and mechanical feel, which makes actions feel very powerful. Because it takes extra time to fully press down the shoulder button, you have to be more aware and prepared for that. And then the start button and D-pad are very squishy, and you can feel this sense of relief compared to the loudness of the joystick. Then we have the N64 controller. While it's often looked down on today, there's really no proper way to play N64 games without this. Whenever I listen to the joystick and the surprisingly loud button presses, what I'm really hearing is friendship. I know I already said that for the GameCube controller, but these are the two consoles of my childhood. I spent so much time playing Mario Party with friends, trying to get through the gym battles in Pokemon Stadium, and of course, Mario 64, that needs no introduction. Something about smashing the A and B buttons feels amazing on this controller. The sound that bounces out is immensely satisfying, and that's because the buttons are laid into the controller with no wiggle room. The GameCube controller's face buttons have a very subtle amount of wiggle to them, but that's not the case for the N64. This makes a difference with how action and platforming games feel. The impact of your presses correlates so strongly with what's happening on screen. It's also interesting to note how the loudness of each buttons demonstrates how important those actual buttons are. Take the D-pad and shoulder buttons as an example. All of these are used in most N64 games, but they're never a core part of the experience. They sound very supplemental compared to the joystick and face buttons. The NES controller is the simplest one I'll talk about, and it somehow merges together the feel of the N64 and GameCube. The face buttons are few and far between, but in a sense mix together the best of both worlds. The A and B buttons have a slight amount of wiggle to them, but at the same time have a very punchy feel and sound. It's a very mechanical press, but also with a subtlety of squishiness. The D-pad is the same way, although it has a lot more squish, of course. The sounds of these buttons remind me of college, which I know is bizarre considering I grew up with newer consoles, but I really got into retro games when I was 18 and 19, and got my first NES around that time. That's when I discovered the joy of NES games. These titles are hard as hell, but when you have a seemingly infinite amount of free time, it was the best time to get into it. I truly fell in love with Super Mario Bros. 3 in college, because I used to play through the whole thing with my friend Nathan, otherwise known as the Spirit for those of you that were watching over a decade ago. We probably played Mario 3 like, I don't know, 15 or 20 times for the couple years we lived together, and it was very joyous and memorable. But that wasn't all. I also grew to love the entire Mega Man catalog since I played those with Carl. When we were in our early 20s, we either played Smash Bros. On Wii U or popped in a random NES game and tried to beat it without guides. Whether we played the Mega Man games, the Ninja Gaiden trilogy, or Street Fighter 2010. Yeah, that was a weird day. And I'll never forget the random night in college when I had the whole place to myself. I ordered a large meat pizza from Papa John's, ate the entire thing while beating Kirby's Adventure for the first time. That night was goddamn epic. And then there's the Game Boy Advance SP. The sounds of this handheld can best be described as petite. All the buttons here have a nice click to them and are very quiet. I think this was somewhat intentional, because a Game Boy can only be so loud. If the buttons were too noisy, it would risk overpowering the sound of the game itself, especially since the controller is right next to the screen. But when the Advance SP was the newest handheld, I spent a large majority of my playtime listening to the buttons. It wasn't often that I could play games at a loud volume, as I often brought it for car trips or doctor visits. Since it's a handheld, it was fairly rare that I was listening to the music at all. The only outlier, of course, is the L and R buttons, seeing as they're the clickiest and noisiest of them all. The last controller I wanted to go over is the Guitar Hero Guitar. I've never been more conflicted about the sound of a controller in my life, because on one hand, the strum bar is pretty loud. In fact, the sound is always droning in the background when you're playing. Even if your TV is loud, you'll still hear the strum bar to some extent. It never really leaves your mind and you can't escape it. But at least the buttons themselves are a lot quieter, and you generally only hear them if you're playing a hard song and hitting hundreds of notes a minute, or if the game is just quiet. This, in tandem, kind of intrudes the game itself, because you can't really listen to the music on its own. That's why the Rock Band guitar took such a different approach, because people complained about Guitar Hero's noisy strum bar, so the Rock Band strum bar is much quieter and isn't really heard when playing. But then for some reason the buttons are a lot louder? Well, that kind of defeats the purpose, but anyway, I'm getting off topic. With all that said, the secret magic of this controller is the fact that you can hear the strum bar. Now, just hear me out for a second. Having an audible cue that works in the same way as a metronome helps time your strums out, which in turn helps you get better at the game. Being able to audibly hear when you strum to a note while hitting a note right or wrong makes a big difference when learning. Since I can play almost every song on Expert, I've grown a very fond appreciation for the noisiness of a Guitar Hero guitar, because the strum bar is a huge aspect to improving. Now, I could probably go on if I wanted and talk about some other retro controllers, but I think you get the idea. What's really fascinating about this phenomenon is the fact that I don't think it'll ever exist again. Case in point, let's listen to a sample of more modern controllers. All these controllers are superior in most ways compared to the ones I brought up earlier, but there's one key difference that these controllers don't have, and that's sound. And no, I'm not talking about the speaker on a controller, I mean the buttons themselves. All modern controllers have much quieter buttons and joysticks, and I think that's probably for the best. While I like controller ASMR as much as the next guy, the near mute sounds of them makes it a bit easier to get more immersed into the games that you're playing. But that's not the only reason that I and many others can't remember modern controller sounds. Yeah, I think we all do this whenever we're playing something. You pull up some other music or a podcast and let it play while you're grinding a game out. And on top of that, you may or may not have headphones in since they're so easily accessible compared to the past. We've become so distracted with other distractions that there's no feasible way that we can pay attention to what our game controllers sound like now. I don't think I'd perceive this out to be a bad thing per se, but it is very different. The way that we all play video games has changed so radically in the past 10 to 15 years. Whether we're listening to a podcast or streaming and talking to a chat, the last thing on our minds is the sound of our controllers. The only true downside is that I believe over time, it'll become increasingly difficult to feel a sense of attachment to the controllers themselves. Or maybe I'm just severely overthinking this, that's all very possible too. But hey, let's finish things up and talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. They're the best and most powerful place to create the slickest websites. New to Squarespace is the Fluid Engine, a next-generation design system that makes it even easier to make a website. There's also Squarespace extensions that connect your store to vetted third-party tools to extend functionality, and the analytics page makes it easy to see who's visiting your site and where people are coming from. I've been continuing to update my website and recently added some original storyboard cells from our animation show a couple years ago. So with that, go to squarespace.com/Nathaniel to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. The link is in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and let me know down below if you have any sort of connection with the sound of any of your game controllers. Or maybe all this is just me, I have no idea. Anyway, I'll see y'all very soon. Until next time.